Greetings and welcome. My name is John Buckman, and I am Assistant Director of the Lumen Christi Institute. Lumen Christi was founded in 1997 by Catholic scholars at the University of Chicago, and our mission is to make the Catholic intellectual tradition a living dialogue partner at the University of Chicago and in our broader society through courses, lectures, summer seminars for graduate and undergraduate students, and virtual events like these. Now, I want to mention a few upcoming events that will be definitely worth your while. This Thursday, May 27th, same time, same place, Renee Girard, Conversion and the Present Media Moment. The panel discussion will be co-sponsored by Word on Fire Catholic Ministries and America Magazine, and we will have Grant Kaplan, Carly Osborne, Father Steve Gunrow, and Cynthia Haven joining us. Also next week, on Tuesday, our Hispanic Theology series will conclude with a special event, Future Directions of Hispanic Theology, featuring Peter Casarella and Michelle Gonzalez Maldonado. Now, tonight's event is the penultimate session of our Hispanic Theology series, which is a part of our ongoing commitment to represent the riches of the Catholic intellectual tradition in all of its variety. It also aligns with our ongoing commitment to bring Catholic wisdom and experience to social and political issues. This series is made possible by a generous grant from the Our Sunday Visitor Institute and co-sponsored by Actus, the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the US, La Comunidad of Hispanic Scholars of Religion, Corazon Puro, the Collegium Institute, the Hispanic Theological Initiative, St. Benedict Institute, the Nova Forum, Calvert House Catholic Ministry, Dominican University Ministry Program, the Ecclesia in America Network, the Hank Center for the Catholic Intellectual Heritage, the Oscar Romero Scholars Program at Catholic Theological Union, Iscali, Commonweal Magazine, and America Media. We'd also like to invite you to support us in 3 ways. First, you can join our mailing list, follow us on social media, and share word about these events with others. Word of mouth remains the most effective means of inviting others into the Catholic intellectual tradition. Bring them with you. Second, at the end of tonight's event, you will be invited to participate in a survey that will help us to gauge what we are doing right and what needs improving. Please fill it out and we'll enter you in a raffle to win a gift card to our favorite independent bookstore, the Seminary Co-op. Finally, you can support us financially by donating today. Please help us to continue to put on events like these for free by going to www.lumenchristi.org/donate. During today's event, there will be an opportunity for questions from the audience. You can, however, post a question at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of our screen. In addition to questions being read by the moderator, we will also give voice to our audience to ask questions. Please note that today's program is being recorded and will stream from our YouTube page and be posted to our website. So that it is easy for you to revisit the talk, a link will be shared tomorrow via email. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing today's moderator, who will introduce our distinguished guests. Raul Zagara is a Peruvian scholar of religion with degrees in philosophy and theology from the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru and the University of Notre Dame, respectively. He completed his PhD in theology at the University of Chicago. Raul, please unmute yourself and start your video. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Good to see you all. Thanks for coming tonight. It's really great to have you all here as part of this phenomenal series on Hispanic theology. I think we're all thankful for the possibility that Lumen Christi has given us all to expand the horizon of the Catholic intellectual tradition, incorporating many voices from its rich and extraordinary variety. Now, the topic that brings us together tonight is one of those in which theology really comes to life. For immigration is very real, ever present, and with immense practical consequences for this and all nations. But this is a hot topic, a hot political topic, often instrumentalized to advance particular agendas. The question for us tonight is how to think about immigration with its undeniable political, sociological, and cultural implications from a theological point of view, from the perspective of moral reflection grounded on the rich and diverse tradition of the Catholic faith. And for that purpose, Lumen Christi has invited two extraordinary theologians who I have the honor to know personally and who I'm sure will make us enjoy this evening. So let me introduce them. First, Nichole M. Flores. She's an assistant professor of religious studies at the University of Virginia. Her scholarship focuses on the significance of Catholic ethics in plural social, political, and ecclesial contexts, particularly in Catholicism's contribution to public conceptions of justice, emotion, and aesthetics in the life of democracy. She has been published in the Journal of Society of Christian Ethics, the Journal of Religious Ethics, and Modern Theology, and is a contributing author at America Magazine. Her forthcoming book is titled The Aesthetics of Solidarity, Our Lady of Guadalupe and American Democracy, an exploration of the relationship between religious aesthetics and justice in the pursuit of the societal common good. Professor Flores earned an AB in government from Smith College, an MD from Yale Divinity School, and a PhD in theological ethics from Boston College. And now to Victor. Victor Carmona is an assistant professor of theology and religious studies at the University of San Diego, his PhD in moral theology and Christian ethics from the University of Notre Dame. Before becoming a moral theologian, he served migrants and urban communities with the Mexican Conference of Catholic Bishops and the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate. His research engages Catholic social thought, immigration ethics, and theologies of migration. His dual aim is to draw from the wisdom of the Catholic tradition, to create a more just immigration system, and to nurture its ability to do so in increasingly pluralistic and interdependent societies. Recent publications include chapters on immigration in Value and Vulnerability, an interfaith dialogue on human dignity, University of Notre Dame Press 2020, and in Sex, Love, and Families, Catholic Perspective, Liturgical Press 2020. Welcome, Victor. Welcome, Nichole. Briefly, in terms of format, we will try to have a conversation guided by some general questions I'll be asking, and the speakers, of course, are encouraged to engage each other. Please, we'll know each other here, so con confianza. And then we will start with questions from the audience a bit before 8, if that's all good. So let me start with one opening question, and then each of you can address it whatever way you want. So what do you see, Nichole, Victor, as the distinctly Catholic elements of an ethical response, of a moral response to the problem of immigration, especially in the US? What makes the Catholic response different from other responses coming from social movements or institutions also seeking immigration justice? Perhaps you can start, Nichole, but whoever wants to. Victor.
I can respond to that. Thank you so much, Raul, for such a generous introduction. And it is an honor to be here with both you and my colleague, Victor, whom I've known for many years now. And I see the names of a lot of longtime friends and new friends in the attendees list. So it's a pleasure to see all of you, even if in name only. And to your question, Raul, one of the things that I really cherish about the Catholic tradition on this question is that it has a unique capacity among current discourses to see nuance in this conversation. Catholic political thinking actually has a really sophisticated understanding of the role of the nation state in facilitating a global common good. And of course, there's discourse among theologians about the extent of that and whether or not that's a good or a viable thing, but it's a very sophisticated discourse that we know how to talk about states, not necessarily as just one thing or just another. We can see both, the advantages of having nation states with borders that protect citizens that are residents of a particular nation, we also see the challenges of that very clearly. And what allows us to kind of hold those tensions together from a theological and theological ethical perspective, at least from my perspective, and I feel free to disagree with me, both Victor and all of our attendees, but I see our very robust and capacious understanding of human dignity and the ethical demands of what it means to honor human dignity as the bedrock of that conversation. Whereas other interest groups on both the left and the right can easily appeal to a political agenda that prioritizes something else as its end. We do not have that luxury. This is not a conversation with a lot of, at least from my perspective, ethical flexibility, because we say that human dignity is the bedrock. And actually, when I taught my first intro class in Catholic social ethics, some of my students were struggling, and I said, if you're ever lost and you're ever having a hard time answering a question, just write down human dignity, because it's always the right answer in Catholic social ethics. Human dignity is what we prioritize. And I say that half jokingly, but I think really it doesn't solve anything. It doesn't make any problems easy, but it is a keystone for this conversation. It helps us to think about the purpose of a border, the purpose of a state authority, the purpose of human rights, the purpose of what it means to protect dignity. And I think in that way, it has a lot of overlap with other aspects of our social tradition that are also hotly contested political issues as well. If we treat human dignity as a bedrock, we have a better chance of having a solid conversation about them.
Thank you. Victor, your thoughts?
So, like Nichole, it's a pleasure to be here with everyone, particularly with Nichole, whom I've also known, we've known each other for quite a while as well. So yeah, I mean, of course I agree with Nichole. What I think is also interesting and helpful from the perspective of Catholic discourse and the Catholic intellectual tradition on migration is that I think that this expertise is made possible in part by two things, among others, but one of them is definitely an awareness by Catholics, particularly Catholics who are engaging in this discourse, that we are part of a global church. That forces nuance on the conversation in ways that I think other discourses are not forced to. So, for example, the principles that we apply to discern what right immigration policy looks like in the US context, those principles must also work in the Mexican context, in the Hungarian context, in the Thai context, and so on. And this is something that I think, again, brings greater precision. Like Nichole, when I teach Catholic social thought to my students here at USD, one thing that I've started doing is also emphasizing that global vision by having them visit the Catholic Conference's websites from all over the world, just so that they see how Catholics look and in different parts of the world and what kinds of concerns they have and how we share many similarities, but also how we are distinct as well in terms of many of our questions. And then the second point, I think, goes to what's behind that. And for me, it is a vision that is grounded in the kingdom of God, in the reign of God. This notion that we should conceive of immigration within this broader narrative. So for example, it's not just an issue of policy, how do we achieve the right policy? But even more broadly, it's the issue of how do we conceive of immigration in a way that finds that right policy mix, while at the same time doing so in a way that speaks to the fact, at least from a theological perspective, that migration is part of salvation history. I mean, it is a natural phenomenon for our species, and it is part of salvation history. So how do we think through that?
Yeah, I really appreciate that grounding, because you know, as someone whose area of interest is religion and politics, of course, I'm always thinking about how particular policies are going to influence the lives of people, both Catholic and not, so the lives of all people. But within Catholic theological perspective, to say that we have that kingdom vision is, you know, that is actually really liberating, in the sense that it gives us a more capacious ability, I mean, you know, more capacity to respond to issues with, you know, with an eye towards our ultimate ends. And, you know, policies, they will fail. They even the best designed ones will reach a point where they will break down, they will fail, they will no longer be useful. And, you know, the role, you know, of a democratic government, in part, you know, that it's, you know, perfecting itself, or, you know, in theory, trying to continually perfect itself, is to revisit those policies and re-examine them. But we as Catholics participating in that pluralistic society, and as members of a global church, we bring to that conversation, that revisioning conversation, this eternal commitment. And that is really, you know, exciting to bear in mind in this conversation.
So guys, let me ask you a question after these very rich interventions of yours. Thinking about this question of human dignity and the importance of the grounding in, you know, faith and the kingdom of God, as you were saying, Victor, how do we navigate questions very, you know, important in the US, like separation of church and state? And how do we position the church and theological claims like the grounding of human dignity in the kingdom of God or something like that, in the very specific, you know, and very charged debates in the US about separation of church and state and the limits of, you know, church and church actors' intervention in the public sphere, I guess.
So, I mean, today's the 1-year anniversary of the murder of Mr. Floyd, and from the perspective of the reality that we're living through as a country, I think that one of the difficulties and one of the challenges that we face is that when we're doing this, when we're trying to engage in the political square to advance immigration policy that is right and just and loving, increasingly, I'm convinced with many of my colleagues that one of the things that we really need to start thinking about, at least from a theological ethical perspective, is also, and I know, sorry, let me take a step back. I think many of our colleagues are already doing this, particularly in the Black Catholic Symposium, but we really need to be more accountable for our own church's complicated past. So for example, I was asked to think about how do we nurture a Catholic church in the US that is willing and able to navigate and advance the vision of the kingdom of God in this reality. And I kept thinking of the idea of American exceptionalism. Here I'm thinking of Orestes Brownson, who wrote a piece back in the 1800s that really bought into this idea for his reasons, but it's an idea that I think we need to grapple with. And notice, I'm not being critical of patriotism, you know, as a virtue. I think it's important, particularly to discern the common good and pursue it. But nationalism, and right now the fact is, I think that when we think about immigration, that's a reality that we need to grapple with as a church, because I think it's rearing its ugly head at times.
Absolutely. And I think just one thing that I would like to keep on the radar in this conversation, there's so much to be said, of course, about the separation of church and state, and how we as Catholics should participate in politics. And there's a lot of really reasonable, very well thought out competing positions about how to do this among Catholic theologians of goodwill. One one way that I've been thinking about this recently has been, what is distinctive about how the United States understanding of the relationship between religion and public life, what is distinctive about that relative to other countries? So I'll just use one example. France, some of you might be familiar with the principle of laïcité, which is the French principle of secularism. And it is, without being reductive and realizing the limits of time, it's more restrictive in certain important respects about the expression of religion within the public life of the Republic than our own situation in the United States. And this has led to many different kinds of conflicts, but most notably in France, the presence of Muslims in public in France has been very contested. And thinking about that, and again, without wanting to be too hard on France, of course, it's its own distinctive situation. It deserves lots of thought and attention. But as I think about that in relation to the United States, where we do have more flexibility in terms of public expression, not just one kind of religious belief, but all of them, I see it as an opportunity for Catholics, if we're willing, to enter into broader conversations about what the public good is. And that is not without its complications, because of course the political orientation of our society right now is highly polarized, to say the least. It's hard to participate in any of or I should say either of the major streams of conversation, although they're, both left and right are, vastly internally diverse, regardless of what the narrative is right now about single-mindedness within political parties. But that the possibility of expressing our own understandings of our very thick notions of human dignity, of common good, and the ethical implications of those teachings within our public life, I think it's a wonderful and important, crucial, really, opportunity in our country to say something of substance to fellow citizens, even those who do, and fellow, by citizen, I mean a very capacious understanding of citizen, not just people who are juridical citizens, but all members of our society, about what matters in this debate from a Catholic perspective and what the values are, and to allow those to resonate with people who are not Catholic. So I teach at a public university, and I am not good at playing the cards close to my vest. So every student I work with knows that I'm Catholic. And what I found to be very interesting is the willingness of students of all different backgrounds to entertain not just my own, particular Catholic arguments about issues, but the arguments of those from other faith backgrounds or no faith background in particular, within our discourse about who we are as a society, because I mean, as my book will make clear once it's out in a month, I think that the richness that the particularity of our traditions, and this is not just me, this is Latinx theology for generations now, really believes that the richness of that particularity shouldn't be hidden. We should find ways to engage it while understanding that we are members of a very diverse, pluralistic, at times and oftentimes conflictual society. And so balancing that expression of our values and who we are with our duty, really, to the common good of our society, I think is really crucial to responding to this question of separation of church and state.
Well, this is perfect context. Victor, go. Yes.
Sorry. So, I mean, really quickly, I mean, so that self-awareness of the U.S. is, I mean, even with all our issues and weaknesses and questions and so on, I find that self-awareness of the U.S. as a pluralistic society something that has helped theological ethical discourse in the U.S. grapple with the question of diversity in a way that theological ethical discourse in other parts of the world hasn't had to grapple, particularly when it comes to immigration, at least outside of certain parts of Europe, including, for instance, France. I'm also thinking of Hungary here. But for example, in the case of Catholic discourse in Mexico around migration, one of the challenges that the Catholic Church there has is that it doesn't have as long an experience as we do here in the US with conceiving of the body politic as one that is inherently diverse. For example, I remember several conversations and even debates there where the question of Mexicans' identity as a mestizo, as a hybrid people, as it were, came into question. And the question was asked, well, what happens with Mexico's long history of being an immigrant and a refugee receiving country, particularly from Spain, during Franco's regime in the 1930s and 40s and so on. And what I found was some resistance and difficulty in conceiving of the body politic as including immigrants and their descendants. They are effaced from history, really, to some extent. So right now, for instance, in that context, the church is struggling with engaging the body politic. And I'm curious, I'm also asking and going into how other countries in Latin America are grappling with this question as well.
Mm-hmm. I'm really excited that you brought up that point, because one of the I think dominant and false narratives that we receive about the status of immigration in the United States is that there are people who just completely reject any sort of diversity, any sort of immigrant community. And actually where I live, where I'm sitting right now, so I teach in Charlottesville, which of course is a very, university-oriented town, very progressive. So if I turn left on the road, I go to Charlottesville. If I turn right, I go to a little town called Waynesboro, and I'm out in rural America. And what I find in Waynesboro is a lot of people who welcome my family. I'm married to a Canadian immigrant, and I'm the granddaughter of Mexican immigrants, and I meet there people who are the great-great-grandchildren of Italian and Irish immigrants. And, so there's that background. And I think it's easy within the national conversations and the non-Catholic ones, as Raul, you gestured to earlier, to elide the fact that when you're in those one-on-one relationships on the ground with people, which is what Catholics really value, that embodied relationship, and not, just a really thin discourse about what's going on in the world, right? That tells you something, but it doesn't tell you everything. And I find that there is a value for those differences and the distinctiveness, and then kind of a search for common values. I grew up in Colorado, but my father, he's from Nebraska, or at least my grandparents migrated to Nebraska. And what they found was, even though everybody was from a different place, and there's a lot of suspicion around my grandparents because they were Mexican, they ultimately fit in very well in the community because there was a strong value for hard work and faith. And those were the things that really mattered to people on the ground, not which party was voting necessarily for which thing at which time. So I think that's that kind of that long history of pluralism and the experience, the intergenerational experiences of living with that, I think, are really valuable and potentially instructive for other nations who are trying to understand new horizons of similar issues as well.
Fascinating. You're just like so many interesting things going on here, guys. So I'm going to try to pose a question that I think draws from what you were saying. And you both have paid great attention in your comments to the question of, on the one hand, the common good, and on the other, kind of the very distinct nature of American society this very, from the beginning, this attention at least, or partial attention, growing attention over time to pluralism and difference. We're also in a very particular moment of American history, it seems. And you both also gestured to the notion of polarization. And by the way, a polarization that connects sometimes with this, nationalism that Victor talked about, that has also some Christian varieties. And there's new publications on this Christian nationalist spirit that it seems to be growing in the last few years. So I guess my question is, how do we keep this complex balance between common good and also attention to difference and particularity, right? Universality across difference, we may call it, in the context of the very heated moment in which we're living. Great polarization, when even posing a notion like common good seems, a bit, idealistic, naive. I guess you already talked about this a bit, guys, but like, is there some counter narrative maybe to this narrative of polarization on the one hand? Or shall we take this polarization very seriously and see how can we address it from a Catholic Christian perspective? I don't know, a few questions there, but whatever you want to say on that.
Go for it, Nichole.
Oh, okay.
Come on.
I was feeling tired before the broadcast, but now talking with you guys, yeah, my eyes have light in them again. So yes, I will go ahead. I think the answer to all of your questions is yes. Like, yes, we should take polarization very seriously because it is a malady, in our body politic. It's something that makes it more difficult, for these kind of individual relationships that I'm talking about. It makes them more challenging to form, and the context of social media, where we're increasingly siloed from one another and isolated from those who have different opinions from us, is a tremendous problem, both from a political perspective, but also from a Catholic perspective. This is not who we are called to be as the people of God, or just people who avoid other people who don't agree with us on matters of politics and policy. That's not that's not it. At the same time, so one thing that I thought about a lot in my as I was mentioning before the broadcast, in my earliest scholarship was alternative metaphors for how we might think of ourselves in relation to others. And one that I've really valued, and I think is both Catholic, but also particular to Latina understandings of theology and culture, is the metaphor of family, of familia. And I put this out there not just to say the family is important or the Catholic Church values family. Yet those things are all true. But when we think of society in terms of I've argued, a large extended family. I come from a huge Mexican family. We've lost count of how many members are in our family, and we just keep growing. We just keep having babies, and then adding people through marriage, and adopting neighbors, and et cetera. We're just a really huge family. And with all of that largeness comes a lot of difference. I have members of my family who voted for everybody, right? There's no candidate that was on the ballot who was left untouched by a member of my family. And that, for me, has been a really grounding institution in this time of such deep polarization, is that I know that my Thea, who I love with all my heart, might disagree with me on matters that are serious and significant in terms of politics and policy, and that my love for her, both as familia, but also as a sister in Christ, has to navigate that there's not another option. And I know there's been a lot of discourse about, whether or not you should, estrange yourself from family members who disagree with you on these urgent matters. And my position is clear. No, you should not do that. I don't think that's the right way to handle these things. But if we think of our society in terms of a large extended family, how does that help us think about what's good for all of us? And I think in part it shows that that ligature is not something that is easily torn apart, right? That it, you know, it can definitely be wounded, but it can also be healed, and bringing that family back together is a possibility. The metaphor has its limitations. You know, families, of course, have become sites of abuse often, and thinking about how we treat one another within our societal relationships, I think, remains paramount in time. You know, Victor already mentioned, you know, we're on this really devastating anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, and just thinking about the wounds that we inflict on other members of our family, I think is also an, you know, an important aspect of that metaphor. But how does our view of who we are as a society and our belonging, not just to other people living in the United States, but to this global church, this global family, how does that change when we think of each other as essentially related? And I think that this is at the heart of our Catholic tradition across generations, but certainly Pope Francis has emphasized family. And, you know, he's Latino, so he's clearly coming from this context where family is often this deeply orienting, socially orienting institution. So I think it's a metaphor. It's one metaphor, and metaphors always highlight some things and obscure others. So I would not say, oh, and no other metaphor can possibly work. But I think family is one worth considering.
I mean, Nichole, I mean, this is one aspect of your early work that I deeply appreciated, particularly as, you know, as a Latino theologian. That and a class I took on feminist theology at Notre Dame. Those were two very, you know, meaningful North Stars for my thinking on this. And what I appreciate about your early work is its ability to have us pay attention in a very similar way to Ada Maria Isasi Diaz, you know, to the messiness of family life as a locus theologicus for the way in which we think ourselves and just even live our daily lives. I mean, when your work also has to see how in Latino communities we have a practice of having very messy, porous borders within our families, right? I mean, mi tío, mi tía, el tío, they're not even really related by blood, but they're related, you know, and particularly by baptism, and then padrino of this, padrino of that, like all of these different sacramental and even, you know, extra sacramental practices that we have as communities. You know, I think they are very valuable to think through this. The one narrative for me within that broad experience of our community, though, for me, it's also the experience of mixed status families. The experience of mixed status families. So these are families that include members who are citizens, permanent residents, and in some cases also undocumented immigrants. And we have millions of people living in those families here in the US context, many of them, you know, Catholic as well. And I find the experience, the daily life experience and its complexities, I mean, the power dynamics between siblings who are citizens and siblings who are non-citizens are marked, and they are challenging. And yet, the way that lived experiences in those families has us conceive of the questions that we're facing as a country. I find it very useful and very, very meaningful. For one, they have us see that it's our paradigm that in the public square of thinking of them versus us, immigrants versus citizens, you know, no, I mean, that's not how reality works. We're actually bound together in the messiness of daily life, at home, in the parish, at work, at school, at the universities. And it's really, I think, becoming aware of how we navigate those. Now, what's challenging for me from that perspective, and this is a point that MT Davila raised already, I think some 5 years ago or so, is the fact that many Latinos, as we join the middle class, many Latinos are forgetting both that immediate experience in their own lives, their own generation, perhaps even their parents' generation. And many of us are also starting to forget our own immigrant roots. And that's something that I think that as Latino theologians and ethicists, we need to keep an eye out for.
Absolutely. I love your expansion of that. You know, we are, as a society, a large, complex, porous, mixed status family. And our obligations to one another within that framework are important to reflect upon. What do I owe to my neighbor, my family member, who is of a different documentation status than I am? We've thought about this in light of COVID. You know, here in Charlottesville, people have been very open and ready to take care of one another, and that's meant in Charlottesville taking care of, until now, a largely unseen, undocumented community, Latino undocumented community that was the most vulnerable to getting the virus, the most in need in terms of our frontline workers. And the way that has reoriented some of our community practice, right? It's too early to tell in terms of rhetoric, but the way that it's reoriented how we go about the practical work of taking care of one another, and I think is notable and is important for reflecting upon in terms of solidarity, that sense that these are our people and they're taking care of us right now in ways that we can't even understand. We need to take care of them. And I found that to be, yes, within that metaphor of the mixed status family, to be really powerful.
Let me ask you something as a follow-up. I think that the idea of the family and the metaphor of the family is very powerful. And I think is good for the imagination, has also normative value, thinking about ethics. But I would like to go back to this question of nationalism that Victor brought up some time ago, and the notion of Christian nationalism. Because I think there's something important here, and this might be one of the elements you noted in terms of the limitation of the metaphor, Nichole, because in these groups, there is a very strong sense of family, but the family is very limited, right? We are the ones who belong to the family. These others do not belong. So I wonder if you can think about, beyond the very powerful uses of the metaphor on some of the normative claims you were making, some more concrete strategies in terms maybe of persuasion, or what kind of things can be done perhaps when we are talking to people who allegedly at least are also Christians and share some of the basics of the faith, to bring them to this notion of a bigger, more expansive family.
I mean, I think part of this has us reconsider and remember and reweave the basics of our faith, particularly, for instance, in terms of baptism. You know, our common, our shared baptism as something that weaves us together into the people of God. And when I was living in Texas, in San Antonio, one of the things that I was very grateful to my parish community and the broader archdiocese was that they were very willing and open to take up conversations like this one on migration in very open-ended ways. I remember a workshop that we organized at my parish, because I had this idea that the parish should be a safe space where people can talk about this. And the parish was able to bring in people from very many different perspectives, both from the left and the right. And what was very striking was how at first some of the folks were struggling with the idea that many of the immigrants who were visiting or who were settling in San Antonio were themselves Catholic and Christian, you know, more broadly as well, and therefore they were not being welcomed into. They would say, "Welcome to my church." It's actually No, it's their church too. They're home. They're home. I mean, this is their home too. So this is, this is one aspect of the conversation that I think is very helpful. Now, having said that, I must admit that one of the beauties for me of the preferential option for the poor and of the idea of charity, charity conceived as love of friendship with God, is the idea that it includes an awareness and a participation in the messiness of daily life with someone who doesn't look like you. Ideally, the parish will do that for us. In reality, though, the difficulties that our parishes, just like our public school systems, are also segregated by our history of redlining. Many of our parishes are not actually really mixed. It's parish life at times is also still very segregated, sadly so. And I still haven't cracked the question of, at least from a pastoral perspective, how do we bring together folks who might not want to be together at first? Yes. And here I'm hearing Virgilio Elizondo just going like, Victor, fiesta, just fiesta, have a parish fiesta. That might be a first approach, but it takes a willingness to take on the messiness of fiesta. And I think we're missing that in our parish life.
I love that you mentioned the parish because, again, I'll speak to my context here in Charlottesville because we have dealt firsthand with the fallout of nationalism and a racially motivated one in the case of the self-avowed white nationalists who organized the Unite the Right rally here in Charlottesville in the summer of 2017. And one thing that was disappointing about that time for me as a local Catholic is that none of our clergy showed up to be in solidarity with the other religious leaders who linked arms and said, no, this is a place of peace. We're not going to carry weapons, but we're not going to hide. I was told that a couple of different parishes just stay away and they'll go away. And I think that we've now seen that, that was ineffective. That was wrong. But in the aftermath, and this doesn't get covered nearly as much, every parish in Charlottesville and in surrounding areas, including this little town to the west of me in Waynesboro, started having these parish conversations, these really hard, really gut-wrenching conversations about race. And I still haven't figured this out. This is a growing area for me. I don't know why Catholics are so uncomfortable discussing race and racism. I know Brian Massengale has lots of ideas and good arguments about this. I still, there's something that I just don't, something that I think is hard to articulate about why that continues to be the pattern, even though we have witnessed so many, in the United States, so many generations of the negative ramifications of the way that whiteness has structured our understanding of what it means to be a citizen. And Catholics should be allergic to that. We know better than that. Our tradition is so much better than that. But to see these parishes come together and enter that discomfort. And, a couple of times the media did show up. Actually, NCR did come to one of these conversations that was at the parish I was at the time and covered the really challenging conversation that happened there. But some of them happened under the radar. When I went to this little town of Waynesboro, there's only one Catholic parish there. And it has, it's Here Comes Everybody because it's the only parish in town. And so there's Black Catholics and white Catholics and every Latino Catholic in the city goes to that church as well. And so, and they didn't ask me to come and lecture about race and Catholicism or white nationalism and Catholicism. They said, we want to start thinking together and praying together about race and racism. And we want to start with our own experience here in our our home about what happened. And so and I've seen other parishes around the country trying to do just this, but it's hard. It's really, it's work that requires immense vulnerability from everybody, including the organizers, because it's asking us to ask really difficult questions about who we are and where we're falling short, where we're sinning. We're Catholics here. Let's use the sin word. In what ways do we sin, both socially, but also personally? In what ways are we harming others? And I think in order for our migration conversation to have the momentum, the kind of the what's the word I'm looking for? The traction. There it is. that we need it to have. It needs to have a consideration of race. And although we have resources within Catholicism for thinking about both migration and racial justice, they're not always in the same place, and they're both a set of teachings that makes us profoundly uncomfortable. So those of you who are working in parishes, I know there's those of you on the call tonight who are on the ground, and I salute you. I admire the work that you do. I know that a lot of you are probably already doing this and a lot more, but having that element of considering race in relation to immigration, it's uncomfortable, but it's necessary.
I think it's also necessary because it incarnates reality. It enfleshes the reality that Jesus is present in the other, the immigrant other, the racially other, and so on, in ways that I think sometimes get lost in the public square. So, for example, in some conversations, I remember this in Indiana and then in Texas as well. And a few here in California too. I mean, what's been interesting is that when people in parishes engage with immigration as an issue, it's highly personalized usually. For example, well, yeah, undocumented immigrants are bad. Illegals are bad. They should be deported because they broke the law. Therefore, they're immoral. We should kick them out of the country. And I'm like, well, sir, what about your friend Juan, who's worked with you for the last 10 years? Well, no, not Juan. I mean, I didn't know that he was here legally, but Juan is Juan. He's a great community leader. He's a great parish leader. He serves every Sunday. He leads catechism in Spanish. No, Juan is not one of those bad people. So at that, making those connections, outside of the public square, I think it's something that as Catholics, I think we do well. It's just I wonder how much attention we're paying to these small, and I hate using the term, but these small wins or these small encounters with Christ in this reality.
Mm-hmm.
Let me pose a final quick question, and then there's a couple of questions I would like to bring to the fore too. But we have been talking about the parish, we have been talking about Catholics and the kind of modeling they can do in all these conversations about race and gender inequality, migration, and all that. And I wonder if we should address a bit also the question of the moral authority and the legitimacy of the Catholic Church in these conversations, right? And I think this is something that we should also unpack, because the Catholic Church is not just the hierarchy of the church, but maybe you have some thoughts about, the relationship between the hierarchy and the laity, and how that plays in the context of how we think about immigration in parishes, the border, and many other places.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great question, in part because it's a deeper Catholic question. Here we're focused tonight on a very particular practical issue, and we're approaching it from Latine perspectives. But our church globally, on multiple levels, on all levels, really has wrestled with this question of legitimacy for decades now, and in the legitimacy of moral teachings. And this is one of the reasons why I always find myself, and maybe it's trite at this point, I need to come up with a new line, but it's what I really believe, just always coming back to human dignity, because framing that that principle as that which guides us, I think, is so key to not just to arriving, at the the right answer, so to speak, or allowing the Spirit to guide us in the ways of wisdom and towards, justice and goodness and truth. But also in terms of legitimacy, this is where I start getting excited as a someone who majored in poli-sci as an undergrad. One of the challenges we face as a church today at every level is that we're a bunch of hypocrites. We're over here saying, oh, well, every life matters in the womb, but we cannot say Black Lives Matter because that, is anathema somehow, even though that's a theologically very sound statement to make, especially in light of our teachings on the preferential option for the poor. There's nothing radical about that statement from the perspective of Catholic theology. I've written about this, so you're welcome to find it and critique me or whatever. But I think that there's nothing contradictory there in those principles. One voice that I'm really excited about in Catholic public life today, that I think this person really is going to challenge both the church and the larger public's view of the church and the moral legitimacy of the church, is Gloria Purvis, who, in light of the murder of George Floyd, spoke very forcefully about racial justice and about these issues to her own personal detriment. But she did so from the same principles that found her very robust, unyielding defense of the rights of the unborn. And I think her voice is really rising to the surface, because of her consistency, because she has the courage of her faith to say, if this is our principle, then it applies to all of these issues. She has a podcast that just launched today through American Media. I can't wait to hear what she has to say about migration. Honestly, this is exciting. It's fun to talk to Victor, but I just can't wait to hear what Gloria Purvis has to say about migration, because she has earned the authority of someone who's not only here to bark about her convictions, but to sacrifice for them and to be consistent in them. And without that, I fear that we lose that flavor, and people see that, right? So I think when it comes to migration, we're being called to say something that might be, anathema to our political allies, but that's the same case with abortion and with end of life issues and with race. These are all areas where our faith calls us to say some really challenging things, and it's scary to do that. But if we don't do that, then we won't be believed in public life.
Yeah, thank you for that, Nichole. I mean, for me, this question of legitimacy is a live one, and it's an important one for many reasons. The way I think about it, though, is I pin my hope in our shared discipleship and what we try and do to live up to that. And I say that out of experience. Back in 2003, I was working with the Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate in Tijuana. And at that point, I remember one day I was going to the clinic and the community center, and I heard in the radio that the news were breaking in Mexico of the sexual abuse crisis. By that point, 4 staffers and 4 bishops, 2 from the U.S. and 4 from the U.S. and 4 from Mexico, so two and two, two staffers, two bishops from each side, had been working on the joint pastoral letter on migration for many years. And I remember I had to pull aside because it became evident that the moral legitimacy of the Mexican bishops and the US bishops had suffered a blow that would put us back in the conversation set us back in the conversation by more than a decade. And I think it ended up happening to the point that the oxygen from the room there was no oxygen in the room left. I fear that something similar, if we're not careful, is going to happen with racism and our inability to have a serious conversation on it, particularly as US Catholics. And then finally, I pin my hope on the people who are running migrant shelters, pro bono law firms, nonprofits that are teaching citizenship classes in the US to permanent residents, because a lot of these men and women are doing their daily grind out of the public eye in a way that I think many of our students and young Catholics, they know that they're there. They're the ones who are keeping us legitimate in the eyes of many. I did it for 6 years. I didn't do it for more. I know people who've done it for over 20 years. And I have nothing but deep respect and admiration for the way that they're living their discipleship amidst this very difficult reality, because they give us hope.
Yes. That's always the best word to end on, is hope, or at least end this portion.
Well, we have some questions from the audience. So let me get to some of those to the extent that we can. There is actually a very interesting question that brings us back to some of the initial thoughts we had about, separation of church and state and how those dynamics play in the context of the US. Gail Mohamed Oxley asks, how can the church protect its status of sanctuary in the context of the public sphere? We could maybe expand this and ask the question of like how the sanctuary status of certain churches, right, plays a role in the context of the pressures that may come from, a mayor, a governor, the federal government, etc. How those, fights for human dignity are negotiated, I guess, with the power of the state or the government, etc.
I mean, here the work of Leo Guardado, I think, is something we need to keep our eye on, because as far as I see it so far, it's suggesting that the Catholic Church in the U.S. is sorely behind our sibling churches, or sibling Christian churches, in terms of providing sanctuary within our temples. I think this is one context where I'm just seeing a note here. So I'll briefly, I think this is high. So Leo Guardado is in the audience tonight. So I'm not going to say too much, except it's something that I think we really need to keep our eye on. When I was working in Mexico with the Mexican bishops, one thing that I learned was that at one point it became illegal for shelters in Mexico to shelter undocumented immigrants, because doing so, the Mexican government in the early aughts was considering it a breach of national immigration law. And I can honestly say that the bishops that I worked with worked behind the scenes in very astute, politically savvy ways to protect the shelters, even when providing shelter in Mexico was illegal. I don't know how that works in the US. I don't know how it looks right now in the US.
I defer all of my response to Leo. Go read Leo's work.
So another question. This one is a question about the biblical witness and migration. I think a very interesting question. The question is by Felipe Legarreta. How have selective biblical passages have shaped the immigration discourse in the US? For instance, the discourse against foreigners and even annihilation of nations on the one hand, Judges, Samuel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the command to welcome the foreigner on the other hand, because you asked for foreigners in Egypt. So you have this kind of ambiguity of biblical witness and how that shaped negatively or positively, I guess, our current ethical stance from a Catholic perspective.
Yeah, I love that question, in part because I'm just a fan of all Bible nerds out there, and the great questions that come to the fore when we reflect with our scriptural witness. When I lived in New Haven for my master's program, I attended a parish where the priest had trained with Raymond Brown, who's this very prominent, legendary biblical scholar. But in the parish bulletin, it said, "Do Catholics study the Bible?" ? And it said, "Yes." We read it together and across generations, and the emphasis being that the way Catholics read scripture that is distinctive from how some, not every, but some Protestant orientations to scripture. And I'm married to an evangelical Protestant, so I say this all with love. This is not like an anti-evangelical rant here, but the distinction is that we read it both synchronically, so with one another, but diachronically in conversation with the tradition and the theological wisdom of the tradition. And I think while we have those tensions, and those are important to note and to wrestle with, and we should have an entire session devoted just to this question because it's such a fantastic one. I think an authentically Catholic way of approaching scripture requires that reflection, in this case, alongside our social tradition, and that we have, in a certain sense, had these debates over the course of centuries and arrived at principles such as the preferential option for the poor and workers' rights and dignity and responsibilities. There's a lot of wisdom that we already have that can help us to reflect on these passages in a rich, complex way. One of the things that really strikes me about Judges as a book is that I've done a lot of thinking about Judges 11 in particular, in Jephthah's sacrifice of his daughter, and a part of that story that I think gets lost and left under the radar is that he's doing this to try to gain belonging in his community, that he's been sent out because he's an illegitimate child of his father, and he's been sent out. So he goes out and he rebels, but he's brought back in because they need his military might in order to defend their people. And he gets in trouble in this battle, and he says, "I'll sacrifice the first thing I see when I return to my home, as long as you Lord allow me to win this battle." And the first thing he sees is his daughter, right? And this is one of those definitionally difficult texts, but it strikes me that this really desperate prayer and this really desperate act that he engages in is because of this desire for belonging. And I think that is a constant theme, is this being cast out and brought back in and wanting to belong, but not belonging. You see this in the story of Ruth and Naomi, and how do you navigate that? Even the tension in the family, where one is a foreigner, who's this foreign woman who I'm stuck with in my family, and how do I relate to her? There's so much richness there that we can continue to reflect upon, across the generations of our faith, with the communion of saints, if you will.
I was looking because I was looking for a book edited by Jacqueline Hidalgo, our previous past president of Actus, because it's a wonderful collection of Latinx interpretations of scripture passages in light of the reality of migration. So I heavily recommend that. Also, the work by Jean-Pierre Ruiz. He takes a look at texts that tend to be at the margins of public conversations on migration. But for me, as a moral theologian, as an ethicist, there are two texts that I think are highly problematic because they tend to be misused and misread in the U.S. context. One is Romans 13. I know, I'm sure you've all remember the Attorney General's misuse and misreading of that text early in the previous administration. But the other one that I think that tends to fly under the radar, that is highly problematic from my perspective, is the misreading of the image of the city on the hill, particularly even through Augustine's reading. In my experience, many well-meaning brothers and sisters in faith really take up the reading of the American reading, Ronald Reagan. They really think that the city on the hill is the US. And that's highly problematic, because that's not the city on the hill, at least not as Augustine conceived of it, and how the tradition conceives of it. And I think it's helpful to be mindful of that, because at times when I read discourse and hear discourse on migration from a faith-informed perspective, the way that the discourse addresses the home countries of immigrants and refugees is very disparaging. Usually under the assumption that, well, we're the city on the hill. The US is the promised land. This is where they want to come. When in fact, many immigrants actually, especially refugees, they come here because they have no other option. Also historically, and I know this tends to fly under the radar in the US context, I've read research that suggests that up to half of Italian immigrants, for example, went back home after they immigrated to the US, because the US was not the city on the hill for them. So this is one passage that I think is highly problematic when we're engaging on this issue.
Well, we have reached the end of our conversation. It was phenomenal, rich, engaging, and now I have to pass the torch to John for the closing comments. Thank you so much, Nichole and Victor.
Thank you. Thank you for your great questions, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Wow. Well, please join me in thanking Nichole and Victor for a brilliant conversation, Raul for doing a wonderful job moderating. I know I have plenty to think about and have been in some ways inspired even. So it's intellectually challenging, but also practically motivating. I'd like to also thank especially all of you who joined us tonight. Please don't forget, if you haven't already, to join our mailing list so that you can be aware of future events coming, and especially register tonight for the final installment in this series on Future Directions of Hispanic Theology, featuring Peter Casarella and Michelle Gonzalez Maldonado. That's in 1 week. Once again, I'd like to thank the people who made this happen. Tonight's series has been made possible by a generous grant from the Our Sunday Visitor Institute, and was co-sponsored by ACTUS, the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the US, La Comunidad of Hispanic Scholars of Religion, Corazon Puro, the Collegium Institute, the Hispanic Theological Initiative, St. Benedict Institute, the Nova Forum, Calvert House Catholic Ministry, Dominican University Ministry Program, the Ecclesia in America Network, the Hank Center for the Catholic Intellectual Heritage, the Oscar Romero Scholars Program at Catholic Theological Union, Iscali, Commonweal Magazine, and America Media. If you go to our website, you can find links to all of those organizations and learn more about them. Finally, I invite you to help support us, help us to continue on in this mission. Share our events with your friends, your parishes, follow us on social media, share our stuff there with your friends. And finally, please do become a supporter of our work. You can go to www.lumenchristi.org/donate, make a contribution, every bit helps. Thank you and have a wonderful night.